Villain or victim? After almost 7 years in Ecuador's embassy, the fate of WikiLeaks founder now lies with a British court. Should the whistleblower be extradited to the US to face charges? I'm Imran Garda, and our newsmaker today is Julian Assange. For many, he's a hero who uncovered the wrongdoings of powerful states and corporations around the world. But some argue Julian Assange is nothing more than a criminal and a spy. Ecuador's President Lenin Moreno is among them. And last week, he revoked Assange's asylum status for that very reason. Assange denies the allegations, but that didn't stop him from being carried out of the Ecuadorian embassy in London, the place he'd spent almost 7 years avoiding arrest. Now he's in British police custody. So what comes next? Here's Haider Abbasi.
After 7 years, Julian Assange is finally out of Ecuador's embassy in London, but not by choice. Assange faces being extradited to the United States for allegedly hacking a government computer. His isolation in the embassy seems to have taken its toll. British police were allowed to enter the building after Ecuador revoked Assange's asylum.
Que la conducta irrespetuosa y agresiva del señor Julian Assange, las declaraciones descorteses y amenazantes de su organización aliada en contra del Ecuador y sobre todo la transgresión de los convenios internacionales han llevado la situación a un punto en que el asilo del señor Assange es insostenible e inviable.
47-year-old Assange sought refuge in the embassy in 2012. That's when he skipped bail to avoid being sent to Sweden over rape allegations. Assange denied the accusations and claimed the charges of sexual assault were an excuse to have him extradited to the US. Those cases were dropped 2 years ago. Assange and his whistleblowing website WikiLeaks have published classified documents exposing the misconduct of governments and individuals. It's most famous for exposing alleged US war crimes. In 2010, it released footage of a US military helicopter shooting dead 18 civilians in Iraq.
Come on, fire!
In July of that year, WikiLeaks published the Afghan war logs, which revealed how hundreds of civilians had been killed by the US military. Then in October, it released nearly 400,000 files on the war in Iraq. It was the biggest leak in US history, exposing the killings of 66,000 civilians. For many, these exposés have made Assange a hero.
The big injustice is the silencing of someone trying to shed a light on Western war crimes and trying to intimidate a real journalist into silence.
But for others, Assange is seen as a criminal for leaking sensitive material and undermining US security. Journalists and supporters of Assange are concerned about the impact his arrest could have on press freedom.
This sets a dangerous precedent for all media organisations and journalists in Europe and elsewhere around the world. This precedent means that any journalist can be extradited for prosecution in the United States for having published truthful information about the United States.
If Assange is sent to the US and convicted for hacking, he could be imprisoned for 5 years. But if he's guilty under the US Espionage Act, that sentence could be life behind bars. In 2016, WikiLeaks published hacked emails from the US Democratic Party. This damaged Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, and some claim it helped Donald Trump get elected. US intelligence says Russia carried out the hack, and Assange has been accused of colluding with Moscow. Although the Australian national still has significant support, he's lost many friends in high places, especially in Ecuador. So is Assange's arrest an assault on press freedom? Or is the US justified in trying to lock up someone who helped to leak sensitive information? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to our panel now. Joining me now from Hobart, Australia is barrister Greg Barnes. He's an advisor to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. In Sydney is investigative journalist Andrew Fowler. He's the author of the book Shooting the Messenger, Criminalizing Journalism. And in Washington, D.C., we have Nate Snyder. He was a Homeland Security counterterrorism official under the Obama administration. Gentlemen, good to have you on the program. Greg, is this an attack on press freedom?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt about that. If you look at the nature of the charge, if you look at the way in which the United States have pursued this matter so relentlessly for 9 years, And if you look at the response of reasonable people around the world, including many journalists in Australia, there's no doubt that this sends a very clear message, and that is if you assist a whistleblower, and you reveal information which the United States does not want you to reveal, the United States and its allies, then you can expect the United States will come after you. There's absolutely no doubt this is a highly political misuse of the criminal law.
So, Nate, are you one of those unreasonable people who disagrees?
I do disagree. I think if you look at the prosecution and the charge as it sits now, it's not about publication of the documents that WikiLeaks is known for. It's about the actual hacking attempt, the espionage, and the dangerous release of information in conjunction with Chelsea Manning as well. And then also to add on top of this, you're looking at further allegations from the Swedish government potentially looking at the allegations of sexual assault and rape. So I think this is, when you look at it from a national security perspective from the U.S., yes, obviously politics are going to play a role slightly, but I think this is pretty cut and dry. This was an attack on our country. It was the weaponization of information to compromise our national security.
Andrew Fowler, when we add to that the fact that the Ecuadorian president is saying that Assange was using the Ecuadorian embassy in London as a center for spying, would you accept that this is more than just a case of somebody releasing information that a government didn't like and being persecuted for it?
I think it's important to focus on the fact that in the first place, Assange was being charged with something that happened in 2010. And the allegation that's made against him is quite specifically dealing with the fact that he's actually helping to protect a source. This is protecting Chelsea Manning. So the idea that somehow he's involved in doing something which is in breach of the Espionage Act, which is in fact implied in the charge, is completely erroneous. He's actually doing his job as a journalist. And to suggest otherwise, as our colleague in Washington was suggesting, I think is disingenuous.
Okay, Nate, let's just sort of forget Assange's personality for the moment and some of the stuff that he's accused of having done within the embassy walls and so on for the past 7 years. Let's go back to the very genesis of everything. Was it not in the public interest for the US voting citizens and others to know that when the US military denied killing civilians in Iraq, this video came out and showed otherwise? Was that not in the public interest?
Well, when you talk about the public interest here, I mean, let's first take a step back here and look at WikiLeaks if we were looking at the real history here of what Julian Assange has done. Calling him a journalist, I think, is a misnomer here. You're talking about an individual who had a platform, who worked very closely, allegedly, as a Russian fence, using that platform to give guise to would-be Russian hackers to exploit information and then use the platform to post sensitive information. When you're talking about public interest, there are mechanisms within U.S. government, within the intelligence community, within freedom of information Act.
This was at the very beginning, and you're bringing up the Russians and so on, right? And again, this is later on, right? I'm saying right at the very beginning, I did one of the first interviews with Assange at the very beginning when WikiLeaks came out with that video. They called it collateral murder, right? And Chelsea Manning had said that she went through the different protocols and nobody was listening. And this is why this was released. And we found that what was released on the video, that what we saw as an international public contradicted what the DOD had said. And there was a lot of soul searching within the United States afterwards because innocent people were killed. So at the genesis of it all, was that not of value, Nate?
I think of value, I think you need to look at, you're looking at, do the ends justify the means? And I think in this case, the means justify the means in this case. And so we did have a national dialogue once that information did get out, but let's not sugarcoat the fact here on how it got out. It was done illegally. It provided an opening to adversaries. It compromised their national security. And, when you're looking at it, this information was put in classified nature, and the release of it actually endangered the lives of our men and women on the front line. So I think that is,
so let's get a response from Greg and then Andrew. Greg, beyond that initial video, especially with the embassy leaks and the cables, the barrage or the torrent, if you like, of cables that came afterwards, it compromised US national security, it put people's lives in danger. Do you buy that?
No, but that's what the security state always says. They do it in this country too. I mean, I've done these cases where, you know, they constantly hide behind national security and compromising our people. It's nonsense. There's absolutely no evidence that the release of the material in 2010 and subsequent releases of material, by the way, have compromised national security. Just to pick up a point, though, that's been made by a colleague in Washington, he says it was done illegally. Most whistleblowers are forced to act in defiance or in breach of the law in order that the truth will out. That is the nature of whistleblowing, and they do it because no one within the system will assist them and deal with the matters. That's the nature of whistleblowing, and long may it live. There are times when the breaching of the law, and we're dealing with a case here in Australia, which is Andrew and I both know about, called Kaleri, which is similar, where revelations in that particular case about Australia spying on East Timor, that would never have surfaced if people had played by the black letter law. And it's fundamentally important to understand that's the nature of whistleblowing, and it's important. I mean, the Pentagon Papers would never have got out if we applied a black law letter of a black letter view of the law.
Andrew,
I can't actually hear Greg at the moment, but just let me say this: that the whole question of whether or not the release of that information over that period of 2010 put people's lives at risk. The Defense Secretary at the time, Robert Gates, said that no lives were put at risk as a result of that material being released. And in fact, he went on to say that the United States was simply embarrassed, only embarrassed by the release of that information. And the only people who really lives were put at risk during this whole fiasco were the people of Iraq and Afghanistan, and the work that Assange and WikiLeaks did to expose what have been called war crimes. Certainly they were mass killings, and certainly there were allegations about assassination squads in Afghanistan, and certainly in Iraq. Those are the things that really needed to, I think, be taken into account. And Assange did was do a good job as a journalist in that particular instance.
Andrew, I want you to address one thing for me before I let you go. There is a general feeling among many people in the industry, for a lot of us who covered this at the beginning and as it evolved over the years, that maybe WikiLeaks started out as one thing that might have been somewhat admirable, but descended into something else. And when we look over the years, there were examples, for example, of Saudi women's personal data being revealed on WikiLeaks that might have put them in danger. We look at the Russian emails, the hacking of the Clinton servers, and so on. Would you agree that there's a semblance of truth to that?
So WikiLeaks should have actually kept that material secret because it aided Trump to be elected. And my point as a journalist is that the public had a right to know that the internal squabbling inside the DNC produced Hillary Clinton, the candidate, and that Bernie Sanders was disadvantaged. I think that was public right to know.
Okay. Andrew, let me thank you here. I thank you so much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Let's bring in Mark Zaid now. He's a national security attorney who has represented whistleblowers. He joins us now from Washington, D.C. Mark, does Julian Assange fit the definition of a whistleblower who's worthy of good representation here?
Not in my view, and I've been doing this for 25 years. I mean, and I agree. I don't think he's a journalist either. He has a platform. He's a publisher. And if that was what he was being prosecuted for, then I could understand some concerns that people could have, but that's not. It's a very narrowly tailored criminal allegation. But we've never looked at the members of the press, even were he to be considered to be a journalist or a publisher. We've never considered them to be the whistleblower. It's always been the individuals who have brought the information to them. And even in that case, by the legal definition, Chelsea Manning is not a whistleblower because she went outside the system. We can discuss and debate, and lots of people do, obviously, as to whether or not going outside the system still makes you a whistleblower generically, but legally speaking, she would not be a whistleblower because she wouldn't be entitled to the protections the law affords.
Right. Mark, the Ecuadorians are saying they're not getting anything in return. This is a rational decision from their perspective, and they're sort of pushing Assange into the hands of, well, the UK authorities and then US authorities for extradition. Is there any evidence throughout this entire process for you, Mark, that Assange is being politically persecuted?
I mean, as my colleague in DC said, there's always a little bit of politics that comes into any type of prosecution, even though there may be career prosecutors who are deciding it. You know, the news reports have obviously demonstrated that Ecuador and Assange have their own personal issues going back and forth. It cost Ecuador millions of dollars for them to house him. They clearly were getting fed up with his antics. He sued them. It's kind of difficult when you bite the hand that feeds you and not expect a reaction. But of course, anything going on between Ecuador and Assange, or that did, is not relevant to what the United States is involved in or the United Kingdom. And at least from what the reports are, the one thing that Ecuador wanted, and this is understandable, lots of countries ask for this, is if there is going to be an extradition, the death penalty wouldn't be applied.
Right.
And this crime that's been charged does not carry the death penalty. In fact, it only carries maximum a 5-year penalty. And I highly doubt that there'll be any charges that would even come close to the death penalty being applied. But apparently there were assurances that
Right.
there would be no death penalty ever.
Greg Barnes, he's facing extradition. Do you still think there's a way to stop it?
Yeah, the Australian government, as a citizen who is highly unlikely to get a fair trial in the United States, who furthermore will suffer at the hands of one of the most brutal prison systems in the democratic world. There is sentiment within this country, and we saw it in relation to the case of David Hicks, who ended up in Guantanamo Bay, where Australians won't tolerate one of their citizens being mistreated in that fashion. And I think there is some pressure in Australia, and particularly if a Labor government is elected in the May 18 election here, which is a less conservative party, that we might see some action in relation to this matter. The other point I'd say, of course, is that to think that Ecuador wasn't pressured by the United States is a nonsense. Of course it was pressured. To think that the United States doesn't put some pressure on the United Kingdom is a nonsense. And we know for a fact that in relation to Australia, because I've been dealing with this case now for 7 or 8 years, that the Americans simply rely on Australia's good relationship with Washington for Australia not to make a fuss about the matter. But I think you might find that the sentiment in this country in relation to the United States has changed markedly since Trump was elected, and there is some domestic political pressure building in this country for Australia to get involved in this matter.
Okay, Nate Snyder, you worked for the previous administration.
Yeah.
I wonder what you think about what kind of trial Julian Assange will get under the Trump administration. I'm not in any way implying that the Trump administration would somehow be able to influence the courts, but you have a president who initially said, I love WikiLeaks, I love WikiLeaks, I love WikiLeaks. I know nothing about WikiLeaks recently. That's the zeitgeist. Is Assange going to get a fair trial?
I think the quick answer to that, I believe so, is yes. Just 2 points to backtrack on some of the comments that were made earlier. One is, I think the other person joining in from Washington, D.C. made some great points, on Assange as well. I think we need to look at him as a chameleon, a cult of personality who wants to shift and change shapes when is most convenient. I think that doesn't take away that he's an actual disruptor and not necessarily a journalist. Second, to the person's comments about the Australian government in relation with the U.S., I want to remind folks that the U.S. and Australia are part of the Five Eyes Alliance. It is one of the strongest alliances in the world that goes back to World War II, and we work very closely with the Australian government. And I think any kind of pressure coming from the Australian government, I don't think is there. Some of the information that has been leaked by WikiLeaks also had implication to the national security of Australia as well. going to your question directly, yes, I believe, regardless of administration, looking at this, whether it's the Obama or now the Trump administration, I believe he would get a fair trial. I think we need to look specifically at what he's being prosecuted. Again, to mention, it's the actual hacking, it's the espionage, it's not going back to the allegations and what had Assange had done at the very beginning of the founding of WikiLeaks. This is very clear on the exploitation, the collaboration with Chelsea Manning, the hacking that went into potentially get information, and then looking at the sort of periphery of potential influence with the Russians or collaboration with the Russians as well. So I think all that aside, I think if it were still the Obama administration, I think he would still get a fair trial. He's going to get a fair trial, and I think the verdict's going to be the same.
Okay, and just some housekeeping before I ask you my next question, Mark. So we don't know for sure if the Swedish are still going to pursue what they dropped a while ago on issues of allegations of sexual assault and rape. That might re-emerge. The extradition hearing will be on May the 2nd. Now, as far as I understand, I'm not a lawyer here, Mark, there is a US-UK extradition treaty that says someone cannot be extradited from the UK for political offense. That might be used as part of the defense. So a UK judge could throw a spanner in the works, and there might also be the chance for Assange to appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. So with that in mind, Mark, is it still possible that we won't see Assange going to the US?
It's certainly always possible. And you accurately cite to the political offense exception. That is a very common clause within extradition treaties. In this particular case, it's going to be a little bit more difficult, and I'm by no means an expert on British law, but it's going to be more difficult, generically speaking, because the crime for which he is accused of the attempted hacking into Defense Department computers would be a crime in the United Kingdom as well. No one could hack into MI5, MI6, the domestic and external intelligence agencies there as either. Now, you also indicate that he could appeal. So it is unlikely that we're going to see him here in the United States for many months. It is possible this could even stretch into next year. And, look, courts are sometimes unpredictable, and we're dealing with multiple foreign systems here. If Sweden enters into the picture, that may throw things into a little bit of sort of a monkey cage, but we'll see. And I do agree. I think he would get a fair trial here in the United States. It's possible they may file a motion to move the case outside of the Eastern District of Virginia because of perhaps unfair pretrial publicity. I could see that as a motion. Don't know if it would be successful. But I think one thing that I would end on is everyone always seems to assume, at least around the world, that a fair trial means that the individual would have to be acquitted or found innocent. That's not what a fair trial is. A fair trial is that the process along the way gives the defendant the opportunity to properly defend themselves. And a fair trial can result in a guilty verdict.
Okay. And people like Greg and Andrew believe that he should not be on trial in the first place. That's where the fault line is, and this is why it's so fascinating. Julian Assange and everything that follows him doesn't seem to go away for now. But gentlemen, we'll keep a close eye on it. Let me thank you, Nate Snyder, Greg Barnes, and Mark Zaid, and earlier Andrew Fowler. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for joining us. Still to come, a special report from Serbia. How is far-right nationalism in the Balkans the source of so much of today's extremism worldwide? Last month's terror attack in New Zealand has triggered a debate on where extremists find their inspiration. The suspect in the Christchurch killings is accused of having written an anti-Muslim manifesto. It's littered with references to ultra-nationalists and historical figures from the Balkans, and there's growing concern among human rights activists that Serbia is becoming a safe haven for far-right extremist views. But right-wing political leaders in Serbia reject any suggestion they somehow inspire violence. Melinda Nucifora explores how Serbia's far-right message has spread far beyond the Balkans.
The rise of the far right. Like so many other European countries, Serbia is riding a wave of neo-nationalism. The difference here is that the movement's role models are convicted war criminals, men with violent pasts whose acts of aggression are not just excused, but publicly glorified.
There are people who say that this very passionate idea of Serbian tradition inspires violence.
No.
You don't think it inspires violence?
Absolutely. Serbs never attack nobody. Never, never ever in all our history.
And what about
In all war, and we had a lot of war.
But what
we
about this?
defend us.
This is Misha Vacic, the leader of one of Serbia's many far-right political parties. At one of his recent news conferences, it's blatantly obvious just how closely the country's wartime past is linked to its far-right present. Sitting in the front row is the former bodyguard of Ratko Mladic, the Bosnian Serb army leader who was found guilty of genocide. The bodyguard was with him during the 1995 Srebrenica genocide, when more than 8,000 Muslim men and boys were murdered. That same bodyguard now provides Misha with personal security and escorts us back to Misha's office.
Some of the people like Karadzic, Mladic, they have been used as inspiration for very dangerous attacks, like in Christchurch.
It's not
true. What do you think is not true?
Taj čovjek, za kojeg smatram da nije normalan, jer je izvršio teroristički napad i pobio te nevine ljude, je lud. I on je tu mogao napiše i moje i vaše ime i bilo čije ime. Tako da on je pronašao ljude koji su se borili protiv muslimana, ali to ne znači da su ti ljudi inspiracija za mržnju prema bilo kome.
He's referring to the assault rifle used in last month's terrorist attack in New Zealand. The shooter covered his weapon with the names of far-right role models. As he drove to a mosque in Christchurch, he played a traditional Serbian military song, and he cited convicted Serb war criminal Radovan Karadzic in his manifesto. And he's not the only one. Serbian nationalists have inspired other white supremacists, including Anders Breivik, who killed 77 people in Norway in 2011.
Do you think that there is any responsibility for promoting those activities and people use that as inspiration?
No, it's absolutely different. Because if somebody attacks you and you defend, you cannot be inspiration if somebody else attacks somebody.
Serbia has a population of about 7 million people, so relatively small in the grand scheme of things, and it's about 18,000 kilometres away from New Zealand. So, how does the ultra-nationalist struggle of such a tiny country inspire such a violent attack so far away?
They don't target individuals per se, but they would target a type of individual. And they do it the same way Booking.com targets you with ads about hotels, or airline companies trouble you with ticket sales, promotions, whatever. So they basically exploit the business model of social media.
Andrei Petrovsky has studied how far-right extremists disseminate their message. In effect, they've learned how to weaponize social media marketing.
What social media also allows in this context is for you, as someone who manages a certain page, to basically target your audience in a very precise and specific manner. So people who are not as radical as you would like them to be would get more subtle messages until the point where they're radicalized and can get the messages that are more, let's say, explicit and graphic.
Human rights activists say Serbia is celebrated within alt-right circles as an extreme nationalist success story. A convicted war criminal is a member of parliament, and the Prime Minister was applauded when she denied Serbs had carried out a genocide during the Bosnian War in the 90s.
Ta nekažnjivost tog zločina I neuspostavljanja tog moralnog otklona od zločina u Srbiji zapravo daje primer nacionalistima, ekstremnim nacionalistima širom sveta da takvi zločini mogu proći nekažnjeno.
Serbia has also become one of the go-to locations for white supremacists to host meetings and film their online propaganda.
Vrlo je zanimljivo da mi imamo priliku da vidimo da među srpskim nacionalistima su česti gosti ultradesničari nacionalisti iz Engleske, iz Britanije, što takođe govori kao još jedan dokaz da su desničari na globalnom nivou, da se sve bolje I snažnije povezuju I da očigledno da se radi tu I o finansijskoj pomoći I koja je potrebna za širenje takvih ideja.
We approached the Serbian government for comment about what it's doing to stop the spread of hate speech, but it didn't provide an answer before this story went to air. Andrei Petrovsky says any form of government intervention would border on censorship.
Having the state monitor anything on the internet in such an intrusive manner is problematic in principle. So we should keep the state outside of regulating the content as much as possible.
He believes the responsibility rests with social media sites. Facebook says it removed 2.5 million pieces of hate speech from the platform in the first quarter of 2018. But with more and more being published and reposted every day, there's no net big enough to clean up the web. Melinda Nusifora, The Newsmakers, Belgrade.
Well, joining me now from Sarajevo is Selma Zekovic. She's the head of security cooperation at the OSCE's mission to Bosnia and Herzegovina. Selma, good to have you on the program. When we talk of the Balkans, and I guess specifically when we talk of Serbia as the nation state, but also Republika Srpska within Bosnia-Herzegovina, can we say that Serb nationalism, particularly of the far-right variety, is on the rise?
I would like to say that we here at the OSCE mission to Bosnia and Herzegovina are working on a number of issues related to democratic processes in the country and helping country meet its international obligations in terms of counter-terrorism. The truth is that the efforts of national authorities, but also international community, have been in the past more focused on religiously inspired violent extremism and terrorism, while something that we are seeing more and more and that security experts alike are identifying is the phenomenon of reciprocal radicalization, which should be dealt as seriously as the other forms of violent extremism. So in that sense, yes, this is something that we are trying to work on through our number of programs that include interethnic relations, interreligious dialogue, but also our work on hate crimes across the country.
Salma, is it just a proliferation of bad ideas right now? Or are we seeing actual mobilization of armed groups within the region?
Well, I cannot actually comment on that. The political discourse in the region is quite heated these days. What we are seeing is that political leaders are using language that is fueling hatred, that is fueling long-lasting grievances in populations, and are using this narrative to pursue their ambitions. And what we are seeing is the heated political situation, which results in a number of tensions that the government in Bosnia and Herzegovina is trying to deal with currently, with support of the international community, including the OSCE.
Okay. Salma Zekovic from the OSCE. Pleasure having you on the program. I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Let's broaden out the discussion now with Emir Suljagic. He's Bosnia's former Deputy Defense Minister and now a lecturer in international relations at the International University of Sarajevo. In New York, we have Neven Anjelic. He's a senior lecturer in international relations and human rights at Regent's University London. And in London is writer and journalist Yanis Baboulias. Good to have you all on the program. Emir, let me start with you. On the ground, right now, in the Balkans, is there a far-right problem in the year 2019?
There has been a far-right problem here since, well, for at least a couple of years. And it has mainly originated from Serbia. A few years ago, actually last year, we had a far-right paramilitary group parade around the town of Banja Luka on January 9th, when Republika Srpska, which is an entity in Bosnia, celebrates its so-called Republic Day. Less than 3 weeks ago, there was almost a parade of a far-right group associated with crimes against Muslims, both in World War II and during the Bosnian genocide between 1992 and 1995. The Balkans have served as an inspiration to far-right extremists across the world, but in my opinion, it's nothing to do with so-called white nationalism. You know, white nationalism is a contradiction in terms. It has to do, and it only has to do with Islam. It has to do with Muslims. It has to do with killing Muslims. And unfortunately, it has not been dealt with. I was quite shocked to hear from Ms. Zekovic the allegation regarding, and I'm quoting, counter-radicalization. It's unbelievable that somebody representing an international organization here would talk about counter-mobilization as if it wasn't Muslims who were actually being targeted by a genocidal campaign between 1992 and 1995. So,
yeah, you know what we're going to do? Emir, I'll tell you what we'll do. We're going to invite Salma back on the program, and you two can discuss this, because I found that fascinating as well, right? And to be fair to her, and this is me trying to interpret this and take it a step further as I bring you in, Neven, let's assume what she fully meant was something along these lines. We have explored and studied to the ends of the earth the type of inspiration that, for example, jihadis who joined Al-Qaeda got from the Balkans, where they said, Muslims are being killed in Bosnia, I was inspired by that, or I was radicalized by that, and I went to fight in Syria, and so on. People have looked at that side of the coin for a long time. But what has surprised a lot of people in recent times is that they see the Breiviks, and they see the Brenton Tarrants of the world, and even the Golden Dawns when I was in Greece, and they look at them and they see these guys are inspired by Milosevic, and they're inspired by Serbia and Bosnian Serb leaders and so on, and Karadzic. Have we failed to see this thing bubbling over the years, Neven?
I'm not sure that it's a kind of failure that will be focused on the Balkans. I would think more globally, because as the First World War, I mean, the shots were fired in Sarajevo in 1914, but the causes of the First World War were not in the Balkans. There were relations between the leading powers of Europe at the time. Right now, we have support for UKIP, a strongly far-right anti-Muslim party in Great Britain in double digits. We have a Pegida movement in Germany for 4 or 5 years already, being very strong street movement. Therefore, we can find it across Europe, this kind of animosity towards minorities. And in case of Europe, the continent is dominantly secular, but based on the Christian traditions, and therefore minorities are Muslims and Jews. Some studies from 5 years ago showed that it is Jewish communities across European continent that are being targeted by individuals or social groups. Therefore, regimes, countries are not exercising policies against minorities, but they exercise such right-wing policies that enable individuals or smaller groups to feel encouraged to take their own actions against minorities. And often, as you mentioned, events in the Middle East, they then translate them, we should deal with Muslims locally, and especially because they are basically cowards. Muslims are in minority, and it's easy to deal with this.
Yanis Baboulias, why is what happened especially in Bosnia in the 1990s, why is it a sort of emotional glue for far-right extremists around the world? Because it seems to get a mention so often.
Yes, it is fundamentally the last live conflict that was fought along religious lines, at least superficially. And this, in the more globalized far-right movement that we're seeing right now, which isn't necessarily attached to like a nationalism which is expressed via a nation state, but rather a nationalism which is expressed via the idea of belonging to a larger civilization, saying the Christiano-Judean civilization, as Stephen Bannon likes saying. They find that this conflict, and because they're strangely anti-imperialist in a way, they find that it could have resulted in a victory of Christians, Serbs over Muslims, and they see this as a field where this battle can happen again, that this is where they can bring and enact this imaginary conflict that they're constructing, and which is now the glue of the global far-right movement.
Right. And so, Emir, what we're seeing from the far right is that they almost saw Bosnia as a microcosm of the type of global war that they would like to envisage. How do you feel about that?
In fact, in Bosnian Serb leadership, people like Radovan Karadzic served as not only an inspiration, but Bosnian genocide served as a breeding ground, as a platform of dissemination of these ideas. It also served, very interestingly, as a place where all of these ideas were actually normalized. And remember, we're talking about ideas that were literally, if not literally, that were quite illegal or completely marginal or marginalized in the 90s. It was people like Radovan Karadzic being wined and dined under the chandeliers of Geneva and Brussels that mainstreamed and normalized these murderous ideas. And again, this is, to me, this is not about race, or this is about different conception of race. Bosnian Muslims are white, but in the eyes of their Christian neighbors, they were never white enough because of their Islamic heritage. And Radovan Karadzic is the central, and the Bosnian Serb leadership has been central to transforming the landscape of ideas in the West. Remember, the Bosnian genocide had an international dimension. Mr. Baboulias wrote a great article recently about Greek volunteers who took part in the genocidal campaign in Srebrenica, but there were hundreds of Russian volunteers flocking to Bosnia between 1992 and 1995. There's a graveyard outside Visegrad, which you could call is you could say is the rape capital of the world, if you will. There is a graveyard of Russian volunteers just outside Sarajevo. So again, the murder, and it was all done through reconceptualization of the Bosnian Muslim as a Turk, right. If you will. And you remember Ratko Mladic on July 11th in 1995 is standing down in the center of Srebrenica and saying this is the time to revenge. To exact revenge against the Turks. So this is and then take a look at, for instance, one of the final paragraphs of the Great Replacement, this so-called manifesto written by Tarrant, you will see that in terms of language, it doesn't differ very much. In fact, it's almost identical to some of the things that we could hear from Serbian intelligentsia and from the Serbian political establishment during the 90s in Bosnia and in Serbia.
Okay, so Neven Anđelić, is Emir giving too much credit to Milosevic and Karadzic and Mladic? Or is he right that they set the tone for the normalization of this, which then spread from the Balkans and had echoes elsewhere? And if you have young people being radicalized elsewhere, it's easy for them to pick up on it.
I think they did something 25 years ago, and now we have complete new generation that is a generation of grown-up people who know nothing else but this kind of society, these kind of regimes that have been set up by them. And this is really the problem that then pushes them or pulls them over towards extremely radicalized groups. It is also the thing that if we look at religiousness, Pew Research Center had publication sometimes in November last year when they put European countries topping with Romania in terms of religiousness, but the rest of the Balkan countries are coming close in the top 10. So we see the importance of religion, and then misinterpretation of religious values is something that is taking place across the countries of former Yugoslavia. I wouldn't go into Albania because there we have United Nations across 3 religious groups of believers. But Greece significantly is very high ranked on the 4th place altogether. So this is one of the issues. The second issue is a crisis of liberal values. And this is something that we can see across the countries, post-communist countries, post-Yugoslav countries. And we see the dominant political views in power are on the right, firm right, or even far right. We can see it in Serbia, but we can also see it in European Union member state in Croatia. And the opposition is disunited, liberal opposition, and they are playing a kind of politics that Putin is playing. In the West, they are not satisfied with him, but the alternative to Putin is a communist party, extreme nationalist party, and very weak liberal opposition. This is what we have the case in Serbia. This is what we have the case across in most of the countries of the region, and this is the real problem.
So, Yanis, I guess there's no easy way for me to ask this question except maybe to ask it in the most absurd way. Do facts matter when it comes to this, radicalization? Because you look at these manifestos and it's a medley of all sorts of things,
Not
right?
at all.
It's Serbia and it's Skanderbeg in Albania and it's the Crusades and it's a whole bunch of things thrown in and stirred. Do facts actually matter? Can you convince people otherwise?
Revolution of 1821. No, this is the issue. We have been trying to fight these narratives for very long by employing fact-checking, by employing counter-narratives and trying to sort of break them down, show them for the nonsense that they are. But unfortunately, that's not how they work. They appeal, they're a sense of, they're stimuli, they're a series of stimuli to the imagination, to the creation of a narrative that makes sense to an individual, which is usually very unstable, to be honest. And the formation of a coherent narrative comes much later. This is true of most movements in history, but now because of the internet, we are watching it as it happens, we are watching it as it spreads across the world. And in this sense, whatever we do that isn't directly disrupting those networks, it's not going to be very effective. We have the same problem with radical Islam. These networks do not just, they're not based on fact, they're based on sentiment. And you can't fight sentiment in the same way. Specifically in what we were talking about before with white supremacy and if it's racial, this is the thing, it's not racial. When they say Turk, they don't mean Turkish people. They don't even mean brown-skinned Muslim people. They talk about anyone who isn't as someone said before, who isn't of the same heritage. And in fact, in the attack in New Zealand, as has been mentioned, the word Turcopharos, which was on the gun of the attacker, that word does not mean only Turks, because the people who got that name also killed the Jewish population in Greece during the revolution.
Right.
It was a very common thing that when a town was sacked, that both Muslims, and those were Greek, by the way, they weren't even Turkish, so it's literally along cultural lines.
Okay, well, it's true, facts don't matter, and that makes it extremely ominous for all of us. Gentlemen, it's been fascinating talking to all of you. I have to move on. Neven Anđelić, Emir Suljagić, and Yanis Babulias, and earlier Selma Zekovic. Pleasure having you on the Newsmakers. Thanks again. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, Benjamin Netanyahu is on his way to forming a new Israeli government. But will the PM's coalition support him in the face of corruption charges? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.